And I'll just move. And when we say bees, most people immediately think of honeybees, but there are 20,000 species of bees in the world, of which only eight are called honeybees and are part of the development of domesticated bee culture, honey production. So 20,000 species. And North America, interestingly, is one of the most beeful continents. We have a very proportion of wild native species in North America, about 4,000 species of bees just in North America. Very important. The concentration is further south. We're sort of on the edge. There are more bee species per square mile in the drier parts of the country, the Southwest, than there are here. And there's a great deal of interesting ecological research on why bees are more diverse in deserts and arid zones than they are in temperate zones like we have here. But we won't go in there. But a little bit of evolutionary biology would help. Bees are very old by our standards, human beings only having been around in some form that we recognize as hominins, as human-like, for maybe 4 or 5 million years. Bees have been around for 80 to 110 million years. 110 million years, first bees as fossils that look like and have the anatomy of modern bees. About 80 million years ago, the major bee families that we have today had already emerged. And we can say then that the bees and actually the bats are two of the youngest groups of animals that we live with today. Younger than the birds, which are really dinosaurs, younger than the reptiles, younger than mammals as a whole. They're important because they do evolve in connection with flowering plants. Flowering plants emerge about 120 to 130 million years ago. And then about 10 or so million years later, there are bees. Bees begin as a group of wasps. Wasps are mostly predators, and the bees are a vegan community of wasps, basically. They are wasps that became vegetarians or vegans, stopped eating other insects or other animals, and began eating pollen and nectar, plants. Very important. Wasps have been around for 100 million years as top predators within the insect world. And then the emergence of flowering plants created an opportunity that was taken by some of the wasps. And their shift from eating flesh and the adaptations that they went through as they changed their diet and their relationship with the ecosystems in which they live produced the bees that we have today. This is a chart of the major bee families that the ones that I have named on the right. There are two there that don't have a name. Mainly in the southern hemisphere. We do not. This worked basically in evolutionary time. So as you move down the chart, these are younger in the evolution of the bees, with the oldest bees being in the aphidy, honeybees, digger bees, and carpenter bees, bumblebees. Group emerges. And way down at the bottom, the cellophane bees, which I'll talk about a little bit later, show you some cellophane bees, very, very widespread here in the islands, are the youngest of the bees, the most derived evolutionarily, with one of the strangest characteristics. We'll come back to that, but just why do we call them cellophane bees? What do they have to do with cellophane? that's a clue to what's special about them. Anyway, we have tremendous, even at this level, of groups of bees that have fundamentally different anatomy, different behaviors, and as I'll underscore in just a moment, the most important of those behaviors is the way they nest and reproduce. But first, let's talk about what makes a bee a bee. What makes it special? How have they adapted to being plant eaters as opposed to carnivores? So the fundamental thing to start with is that bees eat pollen. Now, a lot of insects drink nectar. Nectar is fuel. And you'll see bees and beetles, ants, and all sorts of insects visiting flowers. Nectar is sugar, just pure carbohydrate calories. For flying, for walking, from so many groups of insects will stop and visit flowers to get the nectar. And that ends up with a little bit of your services. So the flies, for example, will enter flowers to drink nectar, to lap nectar, lap with their little crooked tongues. And as they enter the flower, they get a little dusting of pollen on them, which they largely ignore because most flies don't eat it. Stuff on them, and then they'll visit another flower, drop some of those grains off, another flower. Flies are not particularly good pollinators. They move some pollen around. So do some beetles. So do ants. Anything the pollen will stick to that visits a flower to drink nectar will pick up a few grains and potentially drop them off, but probably not at the right address. They might drop it on another species of flower so that the pollen transfer has no benefit to the plants. But you remember that pollinator services, all the pollination that happens is not bees. It's this kind of incidental pollination, incidental to drinking nectar. But bees they eat the pollen too, and that makes them treat flowers differently, behave differently, and focus more on collecting pollen than drinking nectar, which is part of what makes them better, better postal workers than the flies or the beetles, or for that matter, the moths and butterflies and hummingbirds. You can see this, as you see the yellow in here. That's just pollen in the fuzz around the mouth of this bee. And fuzz is what it's all. Bees are, but they have this dense setae hairs that typically are distributed in specific patterns for each family of bees. You had to tell some families from where they're hairy, but they're very hairy. And that's what pollen initially sticks to. So they're designed like little Velcro pads that as the bee moves into a flower, picks up lots and lots of pollen that the bee will eventually comb off as it grooms itself and concentrate, pack for bringing back to its nest. You can see in this little bee, if you look at it, there's a sprinkling of pollen on its face, the sprinkling on the abdomen. And it hasn't even entered the flower yet. It's just standing there and tasting it.
Yeah, half an inch. I mean, really.
Oh, okay, I'll stay near the microphone.
So Fuzzy Wuzzy was a bee.
So fuzzy is yes, bee Velcro is very important. And the flies that are most successful as pollinators, the so-called hover flies or flower flies, of which we have about 125 species here in the islands, are fuzzy flies. they pick up more pollen because they're covered in fuzz. So this is a very critical thing about bees. If you see a fuzzy insect, you might suspect that it's a bee, or at least something that mimics bees, and because of that, also incidentally is a good pollen bus, a pollen transporter. And this extends to some specialized anatomy in bees that you can see demonstrated here. The bee in this picture, you can see, looks like it has little bulging pockets. There are two kinds of bulging pockets on bees, scopy and corbiculae. Corbiculae are called pollen baskets sometimes. So it's a little indentation in the trochanter in the upper leg that bees can pack pollen into. So it's like a pocket on each side. Bees also typically have scopy, which are brushes, also typically on the third pair of legs, the hind legs, on the trochanter, which would be equivalent to our thigh. And the brush is used by the bee to brush pollen from the flower and also to brush pollen off the bee, off the fuzz. So the result is that bees, when they're working, end up with these big saddlebags full of pollen, look like big balls of yellow, white, or sometimes grayish pollen that represent the special power of bees because of their anatomy to collect large amounts of pollen. And so when a bee is flying around through a meadow, rather than going out, picking up some pollen, going back to its nest, flying out again, picking up some pollen, going back to the nest, will continue flying and packing more and more pollen onto its hind legs or wherever else it has specialized bee fuzz for packing pollen. I'll show you one bee that packs it on its belly, which will turn bright yellow usually, particularly in a garden where a lot of the flowers that we have as garden flowers have yellow pollen. And you'll see it, and it looks like it's carrying bags of yellow stuff, but that could represent dozens of flowers that the bee has already visited. And so the specialized anatomy is designed to allow a bee to collect a great deal of pollen, do a lot of traveling before it returns to its nest, unloads the pollen it's collected, and then heads off for more. Other things interesting about bees, and this is not something that is peculiar to or unique to bees, but something that's very important in bees. Bees, like most insects, can see ultraviolet light. We can't, obviously. They can't see red. Red things, red light, which is the longest wavelength light and very close in the electromagnetic spectrum to heat. Red light, bees don't see. There's one reason red flowers tend not to attract bees. Hummingbirds love them, but bees, they look black to bees. But bees have this ultraviolet capability in their eyes, and flowers have evolved to take advantage of that. So that it's not the bee that has adapted by developing ultraviolet vision, but the flowers that have adapted by developing ultraviolet patterns that bees can see and guide them into the flower. So what's here on the left column are flowers as we see them with our eyesight. And on the right is what they look like to a bee in ultraviolet. And you see the bullseye, the target? It's like, here, here, and bees see it. And so lots of flowers have these ultraviolet bullseyes. They're seen by all insects. And again, all insects, basically all flying insects, stop at flowers to drink nectar as fuel, keep them going, keep their flight muscles going. But for the bees, it's like, oh, pollen, and guides them right into where the anthers are and the pollen is available to them. Now, there's another side to that, which is really cool. which is taste. Bees have a very refined sense of taste, but they have two different sets of sensors.
Of the bee.
This is a honeybee, and you can see this beautiful red tongue.
It's amazing.
The tongues of bees
Photo.
have sensors for sugars, so they can taste nectar as they're drinking it. But remember, pollen is what it's really all about if you're a bee. It's the antenna and the feet that taste the pollen. The antenna, as you can see, are tubular, and they have one bend in them, like our arm. That's because for bees, unlike other insects, they're not waving their antenna around to smell what's in the area. They are using the tips of the antenna to touch the flower, to taste it for its pollen. And they have a second set of taste sensors in their feet. So when you look at a bee, you'll see it stands on the flower, and then it bends its little antenna down and the flower with the tips. It's tasting through its feet and through its antenna, tasting. And the sensors on the antenna and the feet have been shown to be particularly sensitive to pollen rather than to the sugars and nectar. So bees have a capability that a lot of insects do to detect sugar, to find nectar, but they have these specialized taste sensors to check to see if there's pollen in the flower, which is what's really important. And you'll see bees do two things. One is land in a flower very quickly, the little antenna go down and off they go again. They didn't find what they were looking for. The other thing you may see is a bee fly towards a flower and then veer off. That behavior was discussed among entomologists for years, and about 7 or 8 years ago was finally solved with some some entomologists who just had a brilliant insight, and they checked static electricity on flowers. Flowers are blown by the wind, and that creates a static charge. And bees can sense that all that velvety fuzz responds to static electricity the way our hair does. So as a bee approaches a flower, if it is charged, if it has a static charge on it, the bee gets the feeling that we have, like when our hair rises, something, and it's like, whoa, and they'll land on it. But once they land on it, they discharge the static electricity of the flower, right? So they touch the flower, discharge it, they leave. It takes a while for the flower waving in the wind to build up a static charge again. So the next bee that goes by and may avoid the flower because it doesn't have that feeling to it that it's a good flower. So bees have these wonderful senses that they can use to find what they're looking for, and flowers are partly involved in a co-evolutionary process, particularly with the ultraviolet patterns, which has helped bees find what they're looking for and helps flowers have sex, right? One other very critical thing to know about bees and to bear in mind when we talk about bees as opposed to other pollinators is that bees provision their young. They provision their offspring. These are just one kind of bee nest. We'll take a look in a moment at other kinds of bee nests, but this is a very common thing for bees to have tube-like nests in wood, in cane fruit canes, in the ground mostly. Tubular nests where they'll lay an egg, pack in a pellet of pollen softened with nectar, basically with honey, with digested nectar. Then build a little wall, and then another egg and a pellet of pollen and nectar, and then another egg, and just all of the bees eggs are lined up in a row in the nest, each egg having been given a little pellet to eat that's just pollen and nectar put together as a kind of a sticky candy. That's critical because that's what most of the pollen bees collect goes to do. Not to feed the bee, but to feed its offspring. And bees have nests like birds. They're not just flying around, and they don't just lay their eggs anywhere. Every female bee has a nest. Different kinds of nests, and there are social nests where lots of bees nest together, and solitary nests where a single bee has its own nest, all separate from any others, and just takes care of it herself. But the other insects that sometimes contribute to pollination, like the flies, do not have nests. They just lay their eggs on plants, usually, sometimes in ponds, on dead wood, but they don't have nests. And most importantly, they don't leave any food for their offspring. They don't collect food and produce food stores, provisions to make sure that their offspring have plenty to eat while they develop into first larval bees and then or larval insects and finally into adults that can break out of the nest and go flying off on their own. So nests, and bear that in mind because what I'm going to circle back to at the end of this talk is the enormous importance of protecting the places on your property, in your garden,
The shingles.
around your home, where your vegetables are, where your trees are, protecting the places that bees nest.
Oh, I think we have,
And nesting may be social in some bees. Social behavior, cooperative behavior has evolved twice among bees. There are two groups of bees, two families that have social behavior. One is the apidae, which includes honeybees, but also the bumblebees. This is a bumblebee nest, and you can see that unlike honeybees, the bumblebee nests are made up of grape-like, the clusters of grape-like spheres. It is wax, a somewhat chemically different wax than honeybees use, but it's a waxy aggregation of spheres, and each sphere is going to be, it's going to have an egg and it's going to have provisions in it. But with bumblebees, the bumblebee family, it's an extended family. There's a queen and her daughters and her granddaughters, maybe up to 50 or so altogether, that all work together to feed the next generation. And with bumblebees in particular, I'm particularly fascinated with them and watch them a lot. With bumblebees, the queen emerges in the spring and she checks out the territory, finds the good patches of flowers. Then she lays the first set of eggs, which are all daughters. They will then follow her out and she will show them where the flowers are. She takes them, shows them where all the good spots are. Then she retires to the nest, and the daughters do all the foraging and bring pollen and nectar back, and then the granddaughters. So that bumblebee queens are very critical because of their memory. And the daughters that become queens, those that leave at the end of the season, find places to spend winter and survive to the next spring, become new queens and have some memory of where they foraged and found food. Yeah. Yeah.
Their daughters
Yes.
during the season.
During the season, yes. Well, they're granddaughters in the sense that they are all they're actually all from the same eggs, but different generations of eggs. Yes.
They're still the
Right. Yes, yes, yes. They're granddaughters in that sense. That is correct. Yes. And that's one of the things that is very critical in making the queen a queen as opposed to just an older bumblebee, is that like in honeybees, she is the egg producer. But the daughters, interestingly, get larger as they're in the later generations. So when you see the first bumblebee daughters in the spring, they're going to be quite small. The second generation is going to be a little bit bigger because there was more food accumulated and they're able to grow longer and now pack in, collect more food. So the first and second generation are quite distinctive from each other in terms of their size and their capabilities. Anyway, um, the bumblebees and the honeybees, which here in this part of the world are domesticated bees rather than native to our part of the world, both produce large social units where there is hierarchy, cooperative activity, more cooperative among bumblebees and more hierarchical among honeybees. But they're not the only bees that are social. The Halictidae, the sweat bees, which are a very large group, of which we have about 40 or 50 species on Lopez Island, the sweat bees, independently developed social behavior, but it's different. They have colonial nests, many of them, where lots of individual females dig burrows side by side and then share guard duties. They help watch everybody else's nests and keep the predators and the parasites out. There's some even greater cooperative behavior among some of the sweat bees, but it varies from sweat bee species to sweat bee species across the spectrum, from highly cooperative, almost a hive, except that it's actually just a place with lots of little nests in it and a lot of cooperative behavior, to just some more social behavior like congregating out in a field of flowers, sharing information, following each other. Very, very interesting group of bees. So it's a different kind of social behavior, but with many of the bees that we have here in the islands, you will find them always in aggregations, which are not just because that's a good spot to dig a nest, but because they're actually engaging each other and helping each other out. Very cool. Yes.
Not knowing why they're called sweat
So this is an old folktale kind of thing, that the so-called sweat bees, or the sweat bees that were described in the so-called old world in Eurasia in the past, were said to land on people to lick the salt from our sweat off of them. They are, like most wild bees, not particularly aggressive, and they will land on people and sniff around and taste and see what's there. Um, so it's not entirely clear that sweat bees need our sweat. But the story got around that that was what they were doing and why they sometimes landed on people, sometimes even on people's eyes with tears and the mucus around our eyes, and lick it up. So from those stories came the idea that these bees, the ones that lived in Eurasia centuries ago, were especially attracted to so that they, and their family name in Latin is Halictidae, salt bees, Halictidae. So it's a very odd thing that has very little to do with what these bees actually look like or what their behavior. On the other hand, it's stuck. So most bees, including most of we have wild native bees here at the islands, are solitary nesters. That is to say, every female bee is a queen. She digs her And then she lays her eggs and provisions her anywhere from a half a dozen to a couple of dozen eggs in one or more little tubular nests. So solitary bees are most of the bees that we see. Most of our diversity is in solitary bees like this little digger bee peering out of her nest. This is actually close to Lopez, Sea Bluff, below the village. And she will have down in that little tunnel.
Oh, if he's out.
A straw that I showed you earlier. This is actually really, really cool kind of bee. We'll come back to digger bees. So because so many bees have solitary nests, the materials they use, the kinds of nests they make, are a very important clue as to the relationships and what makes them together. One of the most important things is what they line their nest with. And one of the most fascinating parts of the differences between different bee species that makes them both resilient in certain ways and vulnerable in certain ways. So in this list, I've got our most nesting types of bees here in the islands. The miner bees and the sweat bees mostly dig burrows in the ground and line them with sticky crumbs of sand. So they lick crumbs of sand. They have an adhesive that they produce in their mouth parts. And so they plaster the walls of the burrow with sand grains that stick to each other with a little bit of saliva glue. The digger bees, that's what I did just shown you in that bluff off the village here. The digger bees produce clay linings. They actually plaster, they mix silt with water, and they plaster the inside of their burrows to a smooth coating. The leafcutter bees snip tiles out of leaves. They leave a very distinctive pattern of tile cutting, little circular holes in leaves, and they stick the pieces of leaves together to make the lining like a tiled bathroom. Mason bees chew up leaves and mud and make something like um, an adobe that they line their nests with. The wool carder bees comb the fuzz off of plants and spin it. And then so they have essentially cotton wool. And the cellophane bee use polyester in their mouths. And so they coat the inside of the tunnel with a layer of polyester. And and typically on the seashore, if there's a rainstorm and it washes out some of the cellophane bee nests, they look like little tubes, like little translucent cigarettes, long with a kind of like a wax paper translucency to them. And that's just the polyester that they produce and lick onto the walls. Carpenter bees, which we'll see a few of when I show you just bee diversity. Carpenter bees burrow into the stems of plants like salmon berries and some of our garden berries, rubus and ribes, families of berries. They burrow in, excavate the gutta percha, the pith, out of the core of the cane, build their nest in the core of the cane, and plug any holes after they've finished so that it just looks like say a salmon berry. And then, of course, the bumblebees and the honeybees, which are Eurasian in origin, but obviously live here in domestic hives, use wax that they produce, waxes that they make from what they're eating. So we have all these different ways of making nests. And notice that a very important part of this is not just closing the nest, but waterproofing it. Because the major threat over the winter to the little larval bees that are developing inside the nest is drowning, particularly in ground nests. So just for fun, so there's a wool carder bee on the upper left, going and carting plant fibers to make this cottony material that they line their nests with. And then the other image is a leafcutter nest exposed in a beetle burrow in wood. And the leafcutter bee has made this tube of pieces of leaves glued together. It looks like a cigar. It's like an old-fashioned Havana cigar. One of the things that I would, in my experience studying bees, that's really important is that bees on the whole are very non-aggressive. They get along with conspecifics, with other members of their own species. They get along with other bee species. They share flowers all the time. I rarely ever see any conflict between different bees landing on the same flower. Bumblebees are sort of, they tend to get flowers to themselves just because they're so big. They're like 5 times of any other bees in our area. But even with a bumblebee, you'll often see it coming in to land on a flower, and a little bee that's already on the flower might make a run for it, or it might just stay there and the bumblebee will veer off or share the flower, as in this picture that I took over actually at East Sound a few years ago of a bumblebee and a cellophane bee sharing a flower. Honeybees are very aggressive because they have big hives and they're territorial. But our native solitary bees and our native bumblebees are not. They don't sting, except if you actually handle them roughly, and they don't defend the territory, even to the point of not defending a flower that they're already on and drinking from if another bee comes and tries to have a drink as well. So bees, wild bees, native bees, are interesting in the way in which they get along, and as a result, you get more pollinator efficiency as a whole, because you've got multiple bees that are visiting the same flowers, often at the same time, and not competing for floral resources, but sharing them. To the point of, I mean, until, of course, all the pollen and nectar has been consumed. That's the major limitation in terms of floral resources, is the total number of bees that can be supported, bee nests that can be supported, but bees themselves are not fighting over pollen and nectar with some species pushing other species out. You do see sometimes with bumblebees, which aren't bees by comparison. I mean, enough to throw a shadow on a flower, but they come down, and flies will generally, the flower flies will just take off as soon as the shadow of a bumblebee comes. Not the bumblebee is going to bite them or anything or sting them, but because they don't want it to land on them. And the bumblebees have a habit of letting each other know whether another bumblebee is welcome. If they're being crowded, for example, or if a human photographer like me gets a little too pushy, I try to push them around my finger to get a good picture. They will give you the finger, and they literally do that. They have, of course, 3 pairs of legs. So the first pair, the middle pair, and the hind pair, they will take one of the middle legs and they do this. And that's to say, enough, back off, buddy. And another bumblebee will immediately take off, because that's the thing, is I go, you're crowding me out. And that's the most aggressive behavior that I have experienced photographing bees at a distance of about 2 inches, and often have had bees in situations like this literally walk off the flower onto my camera, walk around on the camera, and then give me the finger and go back to their flower. So they're really, really, they're fun to deal with, because they are so non-aggressive but so interesting, social and intelligent. So what do we have here? Let's shift to getting specific to Lopez and the islands. We have so far been able to document 229 species of wild native bees in this region, in the Salish Sea. That's Western Washington and the lower Fraser Valley. 229 at least species of wild native bees in the Salish Sea area. And here in the islands, so far, we have found 91 of them. So the islands have about a little less than half of all of the species known in the region. And 91 wild native bees is a lot of species. That's a lot of diversity. Biggest groups within them are the bumblebees, the native mason bees, not the ones that people bring in, but the ones that are native to the islands here, and the miner bees, which I'll show you a few of. Each of those groups is more than 20 species just all by itself. So let's take a closer look at some bees. So I'm moving, these will be my pictures. And they're all Lopez, Orcas, San Juan, Hugh, and some of the other smaller islands over the last 10 or 12 years. This is a bee that you want to be looking for about now. Andrena vicina. Andrena vicina sort of suggests it's in the neighborhood. It's a cousin. It's a neighbor. It's a neighborling miner bee. The Andrenas are all miner bees, which is to say that they all dig simple, straight, pencil straight burrows in the ground, and no particular, again, that they don't have any of the fancy coatings for their nests like the cellophane bees or the leaf cutters or wool carters. They basically just lick grains of sand and stick the walls together with saliva glued sand grains. One thing about Andrenas is they tend to have these backpacks. You see the fuzzy patch on its back that looks like it's wearing a little backpack? That's very common in this group of bees, and they are easily recognized, at least most of the species can be easily recognized from this conspicuous backpack where they have a lot of setae, a lot of fuzz right on the back of the thorax, right behind the head. You also can see the trochanter with the basket of all the brushy hairs that are used on that third pair of legs to hold pollen. And you can see the brushiness, but that pollen. These bees come out fairly early. They're among the first bees we see tend to dig their nests close to the flowers that they eat, and so they don't have far to fly, and they're big and tough. They're I think the biggest and heaviest of the miner bees that we have around here, and Madrona has often told me how much she enjoys seeing them go through a field of flowers. They're so heavy. They'll land on these early wildflowers, and the flower will jump over with the bee hanging on because they're so heavy they pull it down. And so they're easy to see in the first flush of wildflowers, going from flower to flower, the flowers drooping over as each bee lands on it. And they're very neighborly to each other. Of course, each one is a queen. They're building separate nests, but they're totally cooperative in a field of flowers. That's another species of Andrena, of miner bees, rubicundus, the red miner bee. Very, very pretty with a kind of a rust red backpack. See its little face looking at the camera. And then we start getting the bumblebees. I heard my first bumblebee in February, but they're now emerging in larger numbers. And this is one of the spring bumblebees that we see earliest, bright yellow with some black spots on it. And it's Bombus fervidus, and it's sometimes called the golden bumblebee. We definitely have a lot of Lopez. We've seen them in wild areas and conservation areas all over the island. This is a really interesting bumblebee, Bombus voznesensky, named in honor of a Russian biologist whose name was Voznesensky. And it's commonly known as the yellow-headed bumblebee, or among entomologists, called a Vozzie bear. So if you hear entomologists talking about Vozzie bear, this is the bumblebee that they have in mind. Very, very dark, velvety black with a very bright yellow patch on the head and the back of the thorax. These were quite rare when we did our first surveys 12 years ago in the islands. They were restricted to a few of the larger garden-rich areas like around East Sound and around Lopez Village. They have been spreading everywhere in the Pacific Northwest. And as some other bumblebee species have declined in the last 10 or 15 years, their habitat has been taken over by Vozzie bears. We don't really know why Vozzies are more successful and able to move into niches that have been abandoned by other bumblebees, but that is happening, and it's been seen both in Washington State and in British Columbia. That's really cool, and further study of these bumblebees may give us some idea of how they have been adapting to climate change, to changes in floral resources, and why are they so successful? Which presumably, with most bumblebees, is going to be a matter of behavior rather than anatomy. Bumblebees may look different, basic structure, their basic anatomy is all pretty much the same, except the length of their tongue, which of course you don't see unless you look very carefully while they're eating, and some very minor differences in the pattern of the setae, but you can't tell them apart by colors. So interesting that one bumblebee seems to be more resilient than the others. Again, for reasons that are not yet clear. This is our most common. Oh, did you have a question? No, I mean, broadly speaking, yes, but you'll see two differences that are quite conspicuous. First, in the early spring, you're more likely to see queens who have already overwintered. So they're over a year old and they're big. They're about twice the mass of the daughters that they will be raising in their second summer. So the queens are distinctively larger, slow flying, low flying. They look like they're just barely able to get off the ground, and the daughters and the granddaughters tend to be about half the size to a third of the size. Between species as opposed to between generations, not very much, although we have a couple of species that are on average a little smaller. There's a Rufosinctus. It's a bumblebee that's has a red belt on it, which, as its name describes, that's about maybe 2/3 of the size of most of the others. But on the whole, our bumblebee species are in the same range, but generationally, the queens are going to be distinctively larger, and you will only see them early on. When you see a queen, that means that she's just emerged and she's at the stage of deciding where she's going to lay out her daughter's workspace and where she's going to put her nest, because she doesn't nest where she overwintered. She nests where she finds a good, safe place that she can build the first waxy chambers under a rock, or no problem, under a rock, under a log, in some kind of safe, sheltered area on the ground, in the leaf litter. Again, frequently with something over it like a rock that will provide greater protection from predators. So Melanopegus, again, the bumblebee naming is generally kind of descriptive. Melanopegus, which you could translate as black butt, or a black behind, which they do have a black butt behind the lighter colored lighter colored bands that are so conspicuous on this one. This is a typical color pattern of the, guess you would call them the population of Melanopegus, of black-butted or black-tailed we have in the islands. They tend to have this bright orange band, some cloudy light yellow setae or fuzz, and always the distinctive black butt. Big, tough. We find them on little tiny islands. We've seen them fly from Lopez out to little uninhabited islands. They are definitely interested in exploring at long distance of islands in the neighborhood that can provide them an extension of the floral resources on the larger islands that most of them nest. So they are the bumblebee of small uninhabited islands. They are the bumblebee that does most of the work on the tiny islands that just have like less than an acre of vegetation on them. But very important to the way the ecology of the islands here works. Here's a digger. They're in the Apodidae. They're thus cousins to bumblebees and honeybees, but they're solitary bees. They're bees that are related, that are cousins to social bees, but they are solitary and live in tunnels in bluffs, sea bluffs. Remember I said that they line their nests with a kind of plaster? So you get behavior like this. Digger bees tend to nest together. They congregate, so you'll have hundreds or thousands of nests in the same bluff, but they don't help each other out. Each one is an independent queen. But you see them swarm like this because they have to pick up water to mix the plaster that they use to line their nest. So if there's a seep of fresh water on a nice warm day, you'll see up to hundreds of diggers coming out and filling up on water. And then they'll go back to their nest and use the water to mix up the clay and plaster the inside of the nest. Sometimes called mudding. They're mudding along the shoreline here. Beautiful bees. They look like Melanopegus, by the way. Do you look to have the same color pattern? This particular species, which is common here in the islands, we have several digger species, is called bomboides, Anthophora bomboides. It's the bumblebee digger bee because they mimic the larger and more aggressive, at least potentially more aggressive bumblebees, which live in large social groups. So the bumblebee digger bee, and this particular colony is right. It's just below Lopez village, and it has about, what would you guess, Madrona? How many thousands? Tens of thousands of bees every year. Yeah, hear all the buzzing. Happy buzzing. Here's one of the bees that you see off Iceberg Point that's really cool. Anthidium tenuiflora. It's the only native wool carder bee in our region. And so the only bee that lines its nests with plant fiber, with yarn. Very pretty, striking abdomen with the black and white or black and beige, really pale banding on it. They like gumweed. They come out in the summer. And so they catch gumweed after the other flowers along the south end have already finished for the season. They're interesting because they are not exactly territorial, but the male bee will sit in the flower and wait for a female to come and then try to mate with her. So you'll see all these little male wool carder bees sitting in their gumweeds, waiting. And then a female will go by and the male will fly up and try to get behind her on the flower. We have some nice photos of that of mating in gumweed flowers. It's their equivalent of the more aggressive territoriality of the European wool carder bee, which has been introduced. It's now an invasive species on Lopez. And they will actually attack other bees that approach the flowers that they're waiting for their mates in. So very, very interesting difference in the European bee, which is really territorial and will defend its flower. And these little ones will stay in the flower waiting for a female. And if another bee comes along, they leave until the other bee leaves, and then they come back. They're very timid. They also have yeah.
Well, that last one, this one less of. Really, not very hairy.
Right. Yes, exactly. Batesian mimicry. Yes. You're right on it. Yeah. Batesian mimicry, they look like a really terrifying big wasp, but they aren't. And again, they're so timid that if you approach them, they just take off. If another insect approaches them, they just take off. But their color pattern probably lends them a certain degree of protection from some predators because it looks like a predator. And they have a kleptoparasite that looks a lot like them. This is something that's common in bees, particularly solitary bees, will have kleptoparasite bees, which are bees that have gone bad. These are bees that have gone from being vegetarians to being thieves, nest thieves, that will wait for other bees to pack their nests with nectar and pollen. And then when the hardworking bee is off getting more nectar and pollen, the kleptoparasite will climb down into the nest and do typically what it'll do is kill the eggs of the bee that built the nest and lay its own eggs in there. So kleptoparasites are typically mimics of the appearance of the bees that they parasitize, so that the bees around it, given that so many of our bees congregate and many of them, even if they're solitary, share guard duty, kleptoparasites tend to be counterfeits to disguise themselves so that when they come in and they enter the other bees around them, even the bee that built the nest thinks it's another member of the nest builder species. So these parasitize wool carder bees' nests, and they look like bees. Very, very examples of that. There are also kleptoparasites that don't look like what they parasitize, and there are some of the bigger and tougher ones that you could say just don't care. But yeah, kleptoparasites are interesting, and it's a phenomenon that crosses all bee families. We have some extraordinarily interesting ones around that that are worth studying and are actually or relatively poorly studied because so much attention has been given to the bees that do provide pollinator services, whereas kleptoparasites basically just steal the pollen that other bees have stored. Here's a lasioglossum. This is a relatively big one. Lasioglossums are a group of bees that range from about 1/8 of an inch long to about 1 inch long. Many, many different, but similarly adorned bees that are very, very important due to numbers and diversity in gardens and wildlands across the continent. This one, Lasioglossum cissimbri, interesting name because it suggests that it eats a particular plant, which it doesn't. But it's a mustard, yeah. I'm sure but they tend to be found out the wildlands of South San Juan Island and definitely Iceberg and Colville. This is a sweat bee. Really, really cool. And you see all the fuzz and sweat bees. It tends to be around their legs and their thorax. It's down below. It's all this stuff to stick pollen on. This is a longhorn bee, Melicity. This is male bees in the Melicides genus have these super long antennae that function the way the antenna of male moths do. Females, I'll show you a female in a moment, do not. You can see if you look, their eyes are giveaways in terms of this particular group of bees. These beautiful green patterned eyes. And that's what the female looks like. It's another species of Melicides, but the females are very dainty and fuzzy and have little short antennae. So you can tell the males and females apart from their long horns. This is another example of bees being good neighbors. So that's a mason bee that is, in fact, our non-native mason bee, the blue orchard bee, and a cellophane bee sharing a flower, paying very little attention to each other as they stuff themselves with pollen. Leafcutter bees, very, very cool bees. Look at it, it's looking up. It looks aggressive. You see, it's raised its abdomen like it's saying, I'm going to sting you. They never do. Never. What actually is going on is they stick the pollen on a Velcro, fuzzy patch underneath the abdomen. You see the edge of that? It's all orange. The entire bottom of the abdomen is encrusted with pollen. That's where they carry it. It's not on their legs, but on their bellies. It's really cool. Here's another picture, the same species. In a garden, actually, this picture was taken about 100 yards from where we are. Beautiful, beautiful bees. And typically you can tell them right away because you're looking and say, where's the bee fuzz? And then you notice this bright yellow or bright orange crust on the belly, on the bottom of the abdomen, which is all the pollen that she's collected so far. That's Duforia. That's one of the little late summer, early fall bees that are they're in the sweat bee group, but they're likely to use canes or other small woody materials to dig into for their nests, tiny little nests. You can see from the flower behind this, this is a little tiny beast the size of one of the black ants, the tiny black ants around here. And they're frequently mistaken for ants, and I've seen people try to swat them or, no, ants, no, tiny, tiny little bee. And if you look clearly in this, you can see the very fine velvety setae or hair on it, which is enough to transfer pollen and to help the bee collect pollen for its nests. That's a Seratina, which is a carpenter bee group, very, very common as late as September or even October if we have a mild fall. So they get the last flowers. And these are the most common cane fruit nesting bees that you'll find in a salmonberry cane or another cane fruit cane that's left over from the year before, and the bee has burrowed in and built its nest inside the cane. Fairly small, again, sort of ant-sized. And that's Perdita is another cane living late summer bee that you can tell apart because it has a yellow face. There's a plate, yellow plate over its mouth, which is strikingly different than the Seratinas, but also very tiny, very dainty, and likely to be found in the last flowers in the garden in September. This is our most stunning bee, Agapostemon, and the male and female have different patterns, with the male having a yellow banded, like yellow jacket banding, a yellow banded abdomen, and the jewel-like green face and thorax, and the female being all emerald green and shiny like a little jewel. They sometimes come out early in spring, but they're more likely to be found in late summer and fall. They're some of our the final pollen collecting that goes on at the end of summer in wildlands and gardens is frequently agapostomen. They're on all the islands. Actually, surprising that they're not better known, given how conspicuous they are, and that green metallic color is really hard to miss. They have a wasp that looks like them, that parasitizes their nests, that has exactly the same green metallic color and the same green eyes, but it's actually a little wasp about their size that could easily pass for one of these. And these are semi-social. They form, this is a bee that large aggregations of solid, and then the females share guard duties with each other. They work as a co-op. Also makes them very interesting. Nomadas. This is one of the looks like. They are bright red. They are very big, and they are kleptoparasites on many bees. They will, you see them, if you see something flying low, they'll fly like this about 6 inches off the ground. And you see other bees will go to a flower, they'll fly at a higher, generally higher and faster. That you'll see something that's flying that's right over the ground, and it's doing this zigzag pattern. And that's a nomada that's looking for a nest that it can steal from. That's looking for a nest that's not being guarded by the queen. And you'll see them go, and all of a sudden they'll stop. They'll drop to the ground, and you'll see bloop, going down into a tube, into a nest, and checking it out to see if there's still something that it can put to, from a nomada's point of view, a better use. Yeah.
When over, the south.
Yeah.
And we
They may put a temporary, the parasite.
hopefully that like landing close it up again, or
Yep.
like leave it as if it were.
They'll leave it so that it is pretty much like the original. It appears that in most cases, what will happen is that the queen, the female bee that built the nest that was parasitized, if there are still flowers around, if there are still floral resources to be had, will start a new nest. So basically, she just has to work even harder. But it may be close to the end of the season, and that's it. That was her last chance, in which case she has no offspring. Yeah.
So that the multiple eggs in a group, you know, that individual
Right.
queen, and will the parasite try to take over all of them?
It'll go for as many as it can before. But for example, in agapostomen, where there's the cooperative guarding, as soon as a kleptoparasite shows up, as soon as any of the bees, any of the females recognize it, they'll swarm it. They'll chase it off. And that's the real advantage of social behavior in bees that don't form collective hives. The bees that are social, solitary and social, is that they'll chase off a kleptoparasite, and that usually some of the females are around. So that it's really hard. And those are the bees where the kleptoparasites tend to disguise themselves, because they have to get past those guards before the guards see them going into a nest. Whereas nomadas are attacking the truly solitary bees, where if mom is away from the nest, the nomada can do whatever it wants. Yeah, the nomadas are really, really cool. And we've photographed quite a few of them, up to about 3/4 of an inch. They are quite large. And you will often see on kleptoparasites, if you look at them, that they look like they have, you've seen old European armor that has sort of like metal points on the shoulders. They have something like that. It's so that if they're in killing and replacing the eggs, if mom comes back and she tries to pull the kleptoparasite out, those points wedge it in. It's basically functioning to prevent the kleptoparasite from being pulled out before it's finished its job. So you'll often see two bees look very similar, and one has a smooth thorax and the other one has these shoulder points. That's the kleptoparasite. Very, very interesting. Now this is the last one, and then just taking care of Bembex americana is a wasp, which does a lot of here are Lopez. This is truly a wasp. It is anatomically a wasp, not a bee, although it mimics bees to some extent, and it carries a lot of pollen around. They're active all summer, and they're active as pollinators primarily just because they hang out in flowers, they refuel frequently, and they hunt in the flowers, but they don't collect pollen. They hunt flies. And they bring their larvae, the little larval wasps, dead flies. So they're actually in the flowers, working through, say, a garden to collect enough flies to feed their offspring. And they live, like many bees, in ground tunnels. Each Bembex may make several ground tunnels with several clutches of eggs, and she will provision them while they hatch and begin to develop. She provisions them with dead flies or paralyzed flies. So really, really interesting. And because of their fuzziness and the fact that they're always hanging around areas that have a lot of flowers, they tend to do an awful lot of pollination. And they also, while they look fearsome, they look, again, yellow jacket-like, are simply not going to sting. We had an entomologist working with us who once demonstrated that down at Iceberg Point. There's a big colony of these down at Iceberg and another big colony at Fisherman Bay Spit. And at the Iceberg colony, which might have been 50 Bembex nests with the females coming in and out all the time, bringing in flies in and out, in and out. Our entomologist colleague went and lay down on top of the nest, just sprawled out on top of them, and was very covered with Bembex. And they walked around and they sniffed her and she tasted her and everything else, and just kept on going about their business. The very Bembex. I mean, they're only interested in flies. No, find human beings completely superfluous. So they are frequently feared because of their wasp-like appearance, but they actually are kind of neat pollinators, very nice insects to have around. And the major effect they have on the ecosystem is to remove a lot of flies that hang around flowers. Anyway, so I wanted to show you that. Now that's sort of not a like the kleptoparasites, a bee that went bad, but a wasp that actually became more like a bee. So let's just consider for just a bit in closing this down, what we should be doing if we want to have all this diversity in our gardens and our farms. Why would you want to have bees nesting in your garden rather than having bees somewhere in the neighborhood? Well, it really helps if they don't have to fly very far, because when you have weather like we have today, the shorter the distance between a bee's nest and the flowers, the more likely it will be able to come out and pollinate even in bad weather. So with our stormy spring weather and with plants like plums, plums and cherries that love to flower when the weather is really foul around here, having bees nesting in your garden increases the likelihood of pollination significantly, simply because they don't have to go that far. They don't have to brave the weather. They can find flowers within a short flight of a few meters rather than a flight of hundreds of meters or further. So ground nesting bees like the miner bees that emerge early, remember the Andrina vicina, the neighborly miner bee. Miner bees like that are early emerging are really, really good to have in gardens because they will come out in March and pollinate as long as they can reach the flowers. And if the flowers are right there on trees and shrubs over their nests, they will get into them. Diversity, of course, means that you'll have more likelihood that there will be bees in your garden right through the growing season, that you don't have to worry about pollination at the beginning or the end, or where it's really dry in the middle of the summer, because different species will emerge one after another, and some are more likely to come out in spring and some more likely to come out in the fall, with a dozen or 2 dozen different species nesting in your garden. You're going to have bees emerging and collecting pollen right through the growing season. And also, frankly, you protect your bees. If you have bees nesting in your garden, you know for sure whether you're spraying pesticides on them. You can choose not to. One of the great dangers, even frankly, for people with domestic hives with honeybees, is that some of their neighbors use pesticides, and that'll kill the hive, and it will also kill the wild bees in the area. So if you want to have wild bees, you want them nesting where you make the decision whether to use pesticides and herbicides or not. Yeah. Yeah. So there are several things that you really want to leave alone. Rock piles, particularly overgrown rock piles. Bumblebees love them. That's the favorite habitat of bumblebees, is crawling under. So see the little sort of cave over here on the, that was a bumblebee nest. I took the picture actually because I saw the queen go in there and spend some time and then come out with some of her daughters. So leaving a part of the garden or building part of the garden as essentially just rock pile and native plants, and just let it go. You'll get a lot of bumblebees that way, and some of the other smaller bees as well. Not removing some of the old canes from rubus family berries, taking them out in the summer when you're ready to go and collect some of the fruit, rather than taking them all out for aesthetic reasons the year before when you cut them back. Those canes, if they're left for the winter, will often be full of serratinas and perditas, which will emerge and pollinate your berries the next year. Sapsucker holes. Wild mason bees will move into those. If you look really carefully at some of those drillings by sapsuckers, you'll find a few of them have been capped. They're absolutely perfect. Also, leafcutter bees like them. So sapsucker and woodpecker holes, or snags, just down dead timber that has beetle holes in it, just leave them. Or put them in a part of the garden where you can leave them, so that the bees that like holes drilled by other insects or birds in wood have a place where they can safely nest. Those would be the three general categories of, and just having a place in the garden that's scruffy. People like to make everything neat, and we do so much raking and pulling and disturbing the soil that we end up digging up the bee nests that were built the previous season. And so leaving some areas where you don't disturb it, in some places, I know it breaks my heart sometimes. I'm going and digging an area to go and make it nice for radishes and turnips. And I get down and I see I've just broken into a minor bee nest, and there's a few juvenile bees that haven't quite reached the point to break out of the nest and fly. And it's like, oh shit, you know. But we have a part of the garden that never gets done. And they can nest in there and they're safe. And they're no more than 15 yards from all of the flowers that we have. That's really, really important, to have spaces that bees can safely nest in that are not disturbed. And that can include woody material, it can include rock piles, brushy plants, stuff that's messier than you would ordinarily want, but it only has to be in maybe 10% of the garden. And that's the 10% that's going to give you the same services that, say, a domestic honeybee hive would have, except with the honeybee hive, you have to feed them. Whereas these are bees that are going to feed themselves, pollinating your flowers. This is when I was talking about bees in the garden. That's the kind of little holes you see when the bees emerge in the spring. They'll leave little holes like that from the ground nests. These are from minor bees and leaf cutters. Leaf cutters, if you see this, do not spray, because those are leaf cutter bees and you want them in your garden. Yes, they'll take some leaves. They'll do that. Yeah, look how neat that is. It's like it was done with little tiny scissors. It was all done with their mandibles, with their mouth. And you may sometimes see them flying, carrying these tiles. It looks ridiculous. You see this thing that looks like a leaf that's going horizontally very quickly. And then when you look, you realize that the leaf is being carried by a little bee that's flying as hard as she can to bring it back to her nest. So the issue with leaf cutters, their nesting is going to largely be in holes in wood. And by the way, if you want to augment that, we'll just finish with something about bee hotels. You can create the equivalent, just get a drill with a 1/4 to a 3/8 inch bit and drill a few holes in a snag or a log that's lying, you know, in your brush pile. And these bees will move in. So bee hotels are very popular now. There are a lot of reasons not to do it. The most important thing is that if you have bee hotels, they can really only be used for 1 year. After that, kleptoparasites and viruses dominate the, you have to actually literally sterilize them after each year. People don't do that. And after a few years, if you look in the tubes, they're all going to be kleptoparasites. So all you're doing is increasing the kleptoparasite load that bees need to deal with. Houdini fly is one of the new ones that just was just identified a couple of years ago in our area over in Skagit County. And we've had the first reports last summer that they're in San Juan County. If you are raising mason bees, which again, we wouldn't recommend, but if you were raising them, you need to look during the winter, open up the tubes and check to make sure that there are no fly larvae in your bee tubes. People don't do that. What hatches out in spring is flies, not bees. And then they parasitize other bee hotels. So there are lots and lots of reasons in terms of parasites and diseases, viruses, not to use bee hotels, but to let the bees build nests of their own in areas like brush piles, rock piles, snags, and just leave them alone. You'll get more diversity and much lower risk of parasites and viruses. So this is this actually, I like this. This is from a British biologist, you know, within the bee hotel, which is all crammed together, and a brush pile. And, you know, they serve the same functions, but the brush pile much likely to have species diversity and a low risk of parasites. Oh, that's a beginning. And I would leave you with two thoughts. One is that it is just really fun to spend time in your garden watching what visits your flowers. And I very much encourage doing what I have to do from time to time for research, which is just sitting looking at a patch of flowers for an hour at a time and looking closely at every single insect that arrives. You suddenly find lots of different bees that come and visit your garden, and they're all working for you. The second is that you should be really careful to make a distinction between um, having bees for pollinator services and having bees for honey. If you want to produce honey, you're going to need honeybees and have hives and take care of them. You need to feed them, and you need to periodically clean the hives out to deal with viruses and parasites like mites, and they're domestic animals. It's like keeping cows or ducks or chickens or whatever. You have to take care of them. If you don't, the colony will die. Most of what we call colony collapse in North America turns out to be badly managed hives. So it massively has overstated the damage to bees of, broadly speaking, disease and parasites. Because if you don't take care of a honeybee hive and really take care of it, as you would say, domestic cattle or sheep or goats or dogs and cats, you will definitely get parasites and viruses, and the colony will die. And then people tell the USDA that their colony died, and it's blamed on this mysterious colony collapse disease. It's not. It's a collapse of management. So, all power to people who have the gumption, the patience, and the willpower to keep hives and make honey. It's a really, really good local food resource. But if you're interested in pollinator services, raise wild bees. And you do that by giving them nesting habitat and letting them enjoy your flowers. Recognizing them so you don't panic when you see them and think that there's something else and spray them. So getting to know them is a good first step. Providing nesting habitat for them is an excellent step. You'll start seeing more diversity in your garden. And ultimately, don't bring in honeybees or mason bees. Mason bees really are just completely a bad idea right now because they carry disease and parasites, and we already have 20 species of wild native mason bees. So what the blankety blank are we doing bringing more in? It really is a bit of a scam from the commercial bee selling world. If you absolutely have trouble with pollinator services, the only thing that I would recommend is that if you provide nesting habitat, like I was saying, just drilling wood, not a crowded bee hotel, but bee beach cabanas, scattered, and you can get local native mason bees from at least one source in the area. You're more likely to just have them move in because they really like that kind of habitat. And in the worst case scenario, getting them from, there's a source in Skagit County, which does that and then sells the offspring so that they're just augmenting the natural production of the wild species rather than importing eastern mason bees from the East Coast. So that's something to keep in mind as well. But most important, I would say, is make a choice if you're interested in bees between trying to boost pollinator services, which means taking care of wild bees and attracting more just to live in your garden, to nest in your garden, or making honey. And you can do both. But very often, what I think is missing is that beekeepers who are making honey are their bees forage in other people's gardens, right? They have to find flowers somewhere. A truly sustainable and responsible strategy for honeybees is to raise them on larger farms and plant flowering plants, hedgerows around the farm, because there are lots of things like snowberries that honeybees love. They'll go looking for it, and if you plant it, then you are feeding your own honeybees by increasing the total availability of floral resources that they like that are close to the hive. So you can farm for honeybees by building habitat that will keep them more or less close by and ensure that they're well fed in the summer, and then you have to feed them in the winter, as opposed to if you just have a whole bunch of hives and you let them go everywhere and you don't provide any augmentation. You know, you're bringing a domestic animal, you have to plant for it. Like you bring in sheep, you need grass. If you bring in, you're bringing in any of the domestic birds, you're going to have to find grain and bugs for them to go and hunt. You need to augment what's available for those honeybees to be able to stay close. Yeah. Yes. Oh. Yeah. Yep. 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 To leave the flowers. Bullseye. This is a great point. Because most of our native wildflowers tend to finish up early. Most of the flowers that are around in open meadows and fields here in the late summer are European. They're weeds, like the dandelions. But they do provide seasonal food supply for bees that you might want in your garden. So on balance, leaving the weedy flowers alone, like you're describing, actually extends the wild bee season. So if you don't have to get rid of them, let the bees have them. It actually helps. Absolutely. What you're talking about is spot on. Yeah, it's good. It's if we were living somewhere else, we might have the luxury of getting rid of all those weedy flowers that come out in August and September. But where we are, definitely there are a whole host of wild native bees that are around and in gardens in August and September with a large part of what they're eating is dandelions and hairy cat's ear. So they need that in order to be able to survive and keep being active into the fall. So yes, good. It's yes. 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 Uh-huh. Yep. Yep.
Well, how are these bumblebees making it? When they're waiting premature flowers, that's
Yep.
the food form. Elderberries. Right.
They're the first, exactly. What? Yeah. Red, yeah, some of the currents, yep. Well, this is the thing. There is a problem that has been documented in the Cascades, actually, in the Cascade Range, that as our weather patterns change, and they've been changing fairly rapidly for about 10 years now, we are getting a phenomenon that ecologists call desynchronization. It's where, for example, the bees have got their timetable, and it's like the queen bee that's been sleeping through the winter wakes up and it's like, oh, time to get started. And she comes out and it's cold and windy. And well, that's happening more often than some bee species can handle. So we're die off as a result of the fact that they were emerging too early for the weather patterns that we now have. Which also then, when you look at that, think about it in wider terms, well, what can we do about that? Well, one thing we can do, I mean, we can't solve that problem directly, but that's a very good reason to make sure that we have habitat for the mid and late summer bees, so that as they lose the spring, they gain more summer. And that will mean a shift in which species we have, but it'll just be a shift within the normal range of species diversity that we have here, rather than losing bees, actually losing pollinator services, not having enough bees for the flowers that we're trying to get to reproduce. It's really particularly interesting with the bumblebees. It does seem with the bees that if mom emerges too soon, she will go back to sleep and she'll wait for a month or two. Whereas a lot of the solitary bees, the little solitary bees where the queen is all by herself and she's going to emerge in spring and that's it, and she has to do all her business in about 2 months. They take a hard hit if they're early season because they don't appear to be able to put off collecting pollen and building nests. So it could shift the species we have, it could shift our wild bees later out of the range of our foul spring weather. And what we're also seeing, and has been reported by a number of the farmers that we talk to around the county, is that bees on the early season, like now, when we get weather like this or when we get windstorms, the bees are being replaced by flies, which are poorer pollinators, although there are more of them, poorer pollinators, but which are much, much better at getting around in cold, windy, wet weather. So we're seeing that some of the early fruits, like the plums, are increasingly fly pollinated. Is that good? Well, they're getting pollinated, but it takes a lot of flies because each fly only might pick up 6 or 7 grains on its head. And then there's a fairly good chance the next flower it'll fly to is going to be a different species of plant. So the pollen on it's wasted. But if you have millions of flies, I don't know if we want millions of flies. You know, but so this is a conundrum. And the thing is, we are seeing this replacement happen, the desynchronization, and then the flies moving in. And that is, in a sense, almost a whole other story, a whole other night on flies. And there are some flies that are really useful in the garden that also eat aphids. And so they pollinate and they eat aphids, but they are a very small proportion of the flies that we see visiting early flowers like plums and cherries. Yeah.
The numbers of bees or pollinators have been in the islands, is going back from a lot of what you described, you're talking about and fairly short history that there would have been flowers that diversity of food.
Well,
I know that in there were
people exactly, which there were people were gardening camas, which is still, I would expect the acreage to have been comparable. The acreage could have been comparable in terms of how many acres of land had.
So even on Lopez.
Sure. I mean, if you really look around, there aren't that many gardens in terms of acres. We're mostly pasture, we're mostly grass, and that grass is non-native grass. So it's the sheep that really have dominated the last 150 years, and the sheep economy that got established on Lopez in the 1860s and 70s is dependent on grasses which don't feed bees. So we replaced wildflower meadows with grass meadows. We replaced pollen producing meadows with non-pollen producing meadows. And we've offset that with gardens and flower and orchards, which are really critical. But I don't think that that it really is so much that we have had to have gardens to have enough bees, but the bees have had to shift in terms of what kinds of habitats are the source of their floral resources, from wildflower meadows and camas gardens with indigenous people here to backyard gardens and vegetable gardens in the last 150, 160 years, which are very different plants. And it's very interesting to see wild native bees that probably spent thousands of years eating camas and chocolate lilies and the like, that are now eating the petunias and the gardenias in people's gardens. But that's really an interesting adaptation that our bee community has had to shift from let's say a native diet to largely introduced flowers, but their diversity is high, so it seems to be working. Now, the beginning of your question, though, is a very tough one. Nobody was looking at bee diversity here in the islands until about 15 years ago, when John Koch and his colleagues at Utah State University began collecting bees at American Camp on San Juan Island. So the earliest data we have is for the Audis. And the best data we have is what we were collecting, what our lab has been collecting in the last 10 years. John pretty much focused on bumblebees initially. So we know what's happened to bumblebees in the last 20 years. That's about it. There's better information on wild bees from the Victoria and Vancouver areas, but the really systematic studies of bee diversity in the Salish Sea as a whole have been since. Now that tells you something about our ecological mindedness as human beings, that something as important as pollination was sort of just taken for granted until, certainly within all of our lifetimes. That's terrifying. And it's really disturbing. And I talked to a lot of folks who, when we started, and we would say, well, we're really interested in pollinators. So you study honeybees? And we'd say, no, actually, we study wild bees. And people would say, there are? And this was, within 10 years or so. So it's not just that nobody was bothering, but there was a strong presumption in the islands and on the mainland that honeybee hives, that the honey industry and honeybee hives were the solution to pollination. That's how pollination happened. We have honeybees for pollination, and we have honeybee producers, and so we don't have to think about that. And then the colony collapse issue started coming in, and people are saying, oh my God, we have to worry about the pollinators. And that's when the rubber hit the road in terms of, well, are we worried about losing honeybee hives, or are we worried about But that's really been in the last 10 or 15 years. So I would love to know, but there's not any currently known way to dig back into the past through sediments and pollen analysis and things like that to say, well, what bee species were here 1,000 years ago? And most of our bees are generalist bees. We have one exception, one bee that's a specialist in among our wild bees. That may tell us something about how bees adapted to the climate and the conditions that existed historically here. That whereas, say, if you go to the very, very beeful areas of Central California or Northern Arizona or so that have even more bee species than we have, about half of them are specialists that only eat one species of flower.
So what?
Yes.
Because it was of interest to the,
Yeah, you're right.
so we have one bumblebee. Russel going to this so that people.
Yeah,
One bumblebee.
right. One, the terrestrial bumblebee, which Western, yes, the Western bumblebee, which is one that John was looking for when he started his work at American Camp, and has definitely been extirpated from the islands within living memory. But in the last 20 years, yes. But we don't really have good data on which we could say how many other species are lost. So just to give you an idea of where this is coming from now, the as a result of an initiative by President Obama, the U.S. Geological Survey has spent the last 8 years planning a national bee survey to find out how many species of bees live in the United States. And I've been to some of the planning meetings for it, and it's interesting. At the very first, the first seminar that it held with about 200 people who study bees, a nationwide big Zoom seminar, and it immediately split into two camps, two groups of scientists. The first group were the taxonomists, the entomologists who classify and name species and so on. And they said, well, this is great. We want to, we should go and collect bees and find all the rare ones. And a few of them were saying, well, probably for every rare one, we'll have to kill, 500 common bees, abundant bees, because you have to collect a lot of them before you actually find one of the ones that's really rare. And this kind of thing. And now some of the bee biologists are beginning to have second thoughts because of the carnage. And also with one of the meetings, someone in Oregon State who's quite famous with beekeepers as a bee biologist and a bee taxonomist said, hey, I'm not really in favor of this. I've already got 2 million dead bees in my laboratory that I haven't been able to get around to identifying. And another 2 million bees. It says nobody's ever going to get around. So, but the taxonomists have been taking it in the direction of we want to count all the species so we can maybe 25 years from now, or going back into records in the parts of the United States, like on the East Coast, where there are records from 100 years ago, find out which ones we've lost. The other camp were the ecologists, of which I count myself one, who said, the issue here is not how many species, it's pollinator services. It's how many plants are being pollinated and whether that's changing. So we should be looking at whether the relationship between bees and plants is changing rather than just counting up all the species of bees. And it got a little bit bitter in terms of the ecologists being told to sit down and shut up because the taxonomists read the mandate from the executive order that came out of the Obama White House as meaning we have to count and document all the species of bees, whereas the ecologists are saying, but what do we get from that? What do we get? Well, we get a baseline. 50 years, we can do it all again. But the cost of doing that not just the financial cost, but the number of bees we're going to have to catch and kill is so, because you can't really identify most of the species except with a dead bee. So, because you have to take it apart, you have to dissect it. So, with the carnage and the cost, says what will that accomplish, as opposed to looking at are there places in the United States where pollination of particular plant species or crops is falling off? Let's look at pollen transfer as a measure of beefulness, and because that's how it affects us. So anyway, it's moved in the direction of taxonomy. And our lab is pulled out of the project because we don't want to catch 20,000 bees here in the islands in the hope that we'll find 5 or 6 species that hadn't been noticed before. We don't think that's useful. I mean, it's interesting intellectually, but it's not useful in terms of taking care of this place. And most, again, in the islands, what we're finding is that most of our wild bees are generalists in the sense that they will eat all sorts of flowers. They've already adapted to garden flowers, you know, and the idea that somehow by losing out of 100 and some species, or 91 that we're sure are here, losing 2 or 3 rare ones would have a major effect when all of the ones that are left, except one, are generalists and will eat whatever kind of pollen and nectar is around. It just doesn't make sense ecologically. But that's an ecologist view, where we think about, has it all fit together? What role do bees play? Is their role changing in a way that's going to affect the rest of the ecosystem, including us? As opposed to, let's catalog every single species that we can find. And yeah, it's very interesting. The head of the leader of the U.S. Geological Survey project of the inventory in Washington, D.C., a few months ago, circulated a reflection, a written reflection, basically saying, I've collected and killed and dissected bees all my life, and I'm beginning to worry about killing bees. And just got into a reflection of, are we paying enough attention to the ethics of how many bees we kill for every bee that tells us something new or that we can give a name to because we haven't seen it before? And that stirred up a big controversy among bee biologists of, well, what is the point? What's the goal here?
I would think that, you need to look at what, and.
Yes. Yes.
That's obviously
Yes.
something you want to be aware of.
Yes. There are 3 laboratories we know of, one in Germany, one in Australia, but one in Vancouver, BC. Not surprisingly, from my understanding and experience with ecology, all 3 run by women that have taken that view and just said, what we're going to try to do is figure out how pollination as a process is changing, and are focusing on that. And almost all the other work done in North America now is taxonomy. So it is an important scientific question, and about which way we go. And what you're saying, I mean, looking at how the species that carry the load, that do the work, is changing from the point of view of managing our environment and managing our food supply is the critical question. Not, do we have 91 species or 94 species or, yeah. But again, I'm an ecologist, which means that my approach to things is like, what eats what? How does it all fit together? And we don't particularly harbor much fondness for the idea that just counting species or getting to name a new species advances our role as scientists or the fate of our fellow humans. But that's our opinion. I think that one of the things that we're going to do as a laboratory is to focus very much on how changes in weather patterns are changing how pollination happens in the islands, and looking at how the wild bee species that we see most abundant and most successful, not the rare ones, but the common ones and the abundant one, how they're adapting, because those are the ones that are going to drive the changes. Thank you.
So,